Good afternoon. The scripture before the lesson comes from 1 Corinthians 15, verses 50 through 55. 1 Corinthians 15, 50 through 55. These are God's words. I tell you this, brothers, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does the perishable inherit the imperishable. Behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we shall be changed. For this perishable body must put on the imperishable, and this mortal body must put on immortality. When the perishable puts on the imperishable, and the mortal puts on immortality, then shall come to pass the saying that is written, death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting? May God bless the reading and preaching of his word. Amen. Please be seated. Until recently, the experiences of death and dying took place primarily in the home. Even as late as the 1920s and 30s, less than 15% of deaths occurred in an institutional setting, like a hospital or a nursing home. But over the last 100 years or so, as John Wyatt has observed, and you'll probably hear that name several times in the lesson, John Wyatt, but as he's observed over the last 100 years, death has become increasingly medicalized, shifting the focus to the hospital as the locus of dying. Indeed, according to the CDC, over 60% of deaths in the U.S. occur in medical institutions. And those, by the way, are pre-COVID numbers. And so the percentage of deaths in hospitals and nursing homes over the last few years may be much higher than that. Now, this shift in location has followed a shift in our cultural story concerning the meaning and purpose of death, and therefore our approach to dying. A modern medical narrative where the body of the dying person becomes a battlefield. That's the metaphor of Alan Verhey. A battlefield meaning a place where heroic doctors and nurses wage war against death. A metaphor which is fine as far as it goes, because death is an enemy and we should resist it, as we'll discuss in a moment. But if you view death as a complete end, as many moderns do, then the battlefield metaphor easily gets distorted and the dying person dehumanized. As the uniqueness of the individual, with all of the wonder and mystery of his personal story, his loved ones, his joys and sorrows, becomes invisible, writes Wyatt. Instead, there's only a body and an unceasing and ultimately hopeless battle between medical technology and death. Now, in the past, we've discussed how the difference between love and lust is primarily a difference between interests. Lust, in all of its forms, adultery, pornography, polygamy, is ultimately a denial of the human subject. It's a way of negating individuality. As Roger Scruton has put it, the pornographic image, for example, is like a magic wand that turns subjects into objects, people into things, and thereby disenchants them, destroying the source of their true beauty, the image of God in them. Lust, in other words, depersonalizes. It dehumanizes its object, which then disenchants it, as Scruton says. In other words, it attempts to erase its sacredness. The case against lust, then, is the case against the interest that it serves, the interest in seeing a person reduced to their body so that they might be consumed rather than cherished, so they might be profaned rather than prized. The modern medicalized approach to death and dying, I think, takes a similar reductionistic view of human beings, where man is viewed as merely a machine to be fixed and not an image bearer to be revered. And as a result, the modern approach seeks to preserve life even at the cost of human dignity. A second feature of the modern approach to death and dying, and one that relates to the first, is that we've commercialized it. We've commercialized death and dying. And in so doing, we've traded the consolation of home and community for the efficiency of essentially a factory and so-called experts. Now, part of the reason for this industrial shift, this offloading of responsibility and participation to commercial entities, is because it's more efficient at winning this battle against death. But in addition to that, we've also done it because it permits the healthy to focus less on dying and more on living. Meaning that it allows us to avoid the reminders of our mortality by exiling the moribund, the dying, to nursing homes and intensive care facilities, perpetuating the illusion that death is something that happens to other people. A devilish denial that has even taken the Christian church captive. And evidence for that, if you want evidence, you need to look no further than our present practices when it comes to funerals, particularly in what has come to be known as the celebration of life ceremony, where we've turned the house of mourning into a house party with upbeat music and upbeat prayers and upbeat reassuring talk, where there is almost no grieving taking place at all. Indeed, if you were to stumble upon such a service, you might confuse it with a retirement party. Now, as far as I can tell, this is an attempt to reduce the threat of death by sentimentalizing it. In other words, we're living in a time of not just kitsch art, but kitsch funerals. Now, one celebration of life service I attended, and I mentioned this a few years ago when we were working our way through the Beatitudes. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. I mentioned this, but I have to bring it up again because it's the best illustration I have. But I went to one celebration of life service, and it was for a man who had committed suicide. Someone, in other words, who had abandoned all of his responsibilities, including the shepherding of his wife and his young children. And I thought to myself, surely they are not going to do the standard sanitation job, scrubbing the service of any semblance of true sorrow or regret. But sure enough, they did. He was honored like the recipient of a Lifetime Achievement Award, venerated as a great husband, a great father, and a great employee, without a single mention as to the cause of his death or the great sin which lie behind it. And by the way, the one thing that really ruins these celebrations apparently is to have a body present. For no one wants to be reminded, it seems, that the deceased died. It's much preferable to imagine that he just disappeared. And with cremation, that is essentially what happens. Such a sanitizing service is a great way for those present to avoid being confronted by their own mortality. But for the immediate family, the briefness and lightheartedness of it is utterly inadequate. It means that as soon as the hour-long shindig is over and the casserole eaten, the family is left to suffer on their own. Grieving in the modern world is best done in isolation, it seems, so as not to burden anyone else with the reality of sin's ultimate consequence. But such denial of death is not the biblical way. We heard read to us Ecclesiastes 7. We go back there, verses 2 through 4. It is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting. For this is the end of all mankind, and the living will lay it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by sadness of face the heart is made glad. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. The object of mourning here in this passage is death itself. Solomon essentially saying to modern man that in spite of all of your scientific and technological advancement, it remains the case that from the moment you are born, you are on a journey to death. And therefore, each of you must come face to face with the grim reality that your future lies in a grave, or maybe in an urn, which is the ultimate consequence of your sin. And such an acknowledgement is good for the soul, says the wise man. For lament leads to laughter. Blessed are those who mourn, said Jesus, for they shall be comforted. Now, in the pre-modern world, things were, of course, very different. In part because their lack of technology mercifully prevented this kind of disconnected approach. They couldn't escape the reality of death. They were surrounded by it. And there was no industry for them to hand the responsibilities associated with it over to them. So they were forced to deal with it, meaning that they had to learn how to die well. And by the way, this would be something that would be passed down generation after generation. How to die well and how to help others to do so. In the modern world, we think that we have avoided this burden. And so, by the way, we've lost the knowledge on how to die well, and we're dependent upon the hospital, apparently, to tell us. But we think we've avoided this burden by creating an industry to handle the dying for us. It's my impression that they're not doing a sufficient job. Let me give you one last illustration concerning this. This works to highlight how the commercialization of this industry has led to depersonalization. When my sister-in-law passed away about 1.5 years ago, fortunately she died at home. But a few hours after her death, the undertakers came, and these two individuals looked like something out of a Tim Burton movie. I mean, you know, I guess it was a mother and her son, but they almost looked like twins separated like 20 years, but they both wore these black suits. And they were foreign. They didn't speak English. The only thing they could say was, "My condolences," and they would just repeat that every time they saw you. And the language they spoke, I could not recognize. In fact, not only did I not recognize it, it sounded utterly foreign to me. It was like an alien sort of language, and they would, speak and babble back and forth to each other as they took the body of my sister-in-law and stuffed it in this bag, and then took her outside and threw her in the back of this unmarked van and then sped off. And the thought occurred to me that if this had taken place 2 hours earlier, we would have fought those people from touching Laura, even if it meant fighting to death. But for some reason we thought, the whole time I thought this is just wrong, but modern people tend to think, well, it's just the body, it doesn't matter, right? The soul is gone, the soul's the only thing that's important, the body doesn't matter. That is not our Christian tradition at all. In the history of the Christian church, the body of the deceased one was still viewed as sacred. That's why they would bury the body on their own land. They did so in order to watch over the body until the resurrection, to make sure that no one defiled it or abused it or did something to it. Your obligation didn't end at their death. It continued. It's why there are cemeteries connected to church buildings, so that the church, which in their mind they thought would go on and on forever, right? That particular church would stay there for generation after generation, and the church itself could watch over those bodies until the resurrection. That was then expanded into, a city itself would have the cemetery as part of the city. The community would be watching over these bodies. Of course, today, cemeteries, we want them out of sight, right? So they can be out of mind. They're away. You never see them unless you go there to bury someone else. That's not the Christian story. The Christian story, as we read in 1 Corinthians 15, is that there is a reuniting of the soul with its body, with this body. Now it will be glorified, it will be raised up, it will be perfected. But Christians have always believed that it's the same body, and that body is sacred. You might think of it this way. Well, terrorists, right? Barbarians, they'll kill a group of people that they hate, and what do? They drag their body through the city streets. They abuse the body, right? They hang it up, they crucify it and leave it there for weeks on end, right? That we have this sense that the death is horrific, but then to treat the body in that way is like a double sin against the community. A more recent alternative to the medicalized narrative, this notion that the body is the place where the battle for survival is to be fought, is called the natural death movement. This approach was pioneered by psychiatrist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in her 1969 best-selling book On Death and Dying. In her work, Kubler-Ross outlines the now famous 5 stages of grief that she argued are experienced by those facing death: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. These 5 stages have been enormously influential, having worked their way down into the soil of common sense, even though there is little empirical evidence to support them. In fact, most professional counselors view them as being wholly discredited. But at the heart of this movement was the belief that death is natural and therefore should not be denied. That it's just part of the biological cycle of nature, the circle of life that every animal follows. They are born, they live, and then they die. Death is just part of the ecology of the natural order. We die so that others can be born. Therefore, rather than running from death, we should just embrace it. In fact, that kind of acceptance represents a critical step forward in a person's journey to self-actualization, they would say, the actualizing of their potential. Because acknowledging our finitude will spur us on to making the most of the life that we have been given, to make us grateful for it, and to live life with gusto. Therefore, death in this view is not a negation of life, but an affirmation of it. Now, it's important to note that there is a Christian version of this teaching that predates it, that goes back to at least the 15th century, originating in a text called the Book of the Craft of Dying Well, which was extremely influential, and within which is this extraordinary eulogy. Death is nothing else but a going out of prison, an ending of exile, and discharging of a heavy burden that is the body, finishing of all infirmities, escaping of all perils, destroying of all evils, breaking of all bonds, paying of natural debt, returning again to his own country, and entering into bliss and joy. And because of this liberating quality of death, this book argues, we should receive death as a well-beloved and trusted friend. Now, such a view was popular during a time when Stoicism was very influential. This idea of being stoic and just having sort of a steely resolve against even the most ugly truths of the world. And also kind of Greek dualism, which viewed the physical body and the world itself as a prison. You can see that sort of language being present. But here's the thing. One real weakness of the death is natural movement, whether it's the Christian version or the more recent secular version, is that it doesn't account for the wrongness of death. Death is not natural. It's absolutely unnatural. And it is a thief that not only steals our irreplaceable loved ones, but frustrates our labors. It's because of this great sabotaging effect of death that Solomon laments this in Ecclesiastes 2:11. Then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil I had expended in doing it, and behold, all was vanity, and a striving after wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. All of Solomon's admirable achievements, everything that he had built, every advantage he had gained, every victory he had won, all of it, in the end, he says, profited him nothing. And that's because it was only a matter of time before all of his efforts would be undone in what we could call the natural entropy of the universe. Entropy meaning the death of the universe. As his heirs squandered his fortune, and his kingdom fell into corruption, as his gold rusted and his garments were eaten by moths. All of the order that he had imposed upon the world, all of the potential that he had actualized, all of the cultivation that he had superintended would inevitably return to its original state of chaos. Because this is the natural progression, or should we say the unnatural regression of things in this fallen world. They decay, they deteriorate, they die. And if this is the end of all of our labor, he thought to himself, if it is to end in nothing, then what's the point of any of it? Why bother tilling the earth by the sweat of your brow, only for it to return to an overgrown state once left unattended by your dad? And one can certainly feel the force of such reasoning, because what remains of Solomon's kingdom today, of all of these awe-inspiring achievements that we read about? What remains? Nothing. But as I mentioned before, our situation is even worse than this. We've discussed this in the past, but it's worse than Solomon could have imagined, because not only do civilizations face extinction, which was his thought, when they're neglected, but so does our entire universe. This is something the philosopher Bill Craig likes to talk about and does so very powerfully. But if you think about it this way, according to the second law of thermodynamics, the universe is expanding. And everything in it is moving further and further apart. And as it does so, it grows colder as all of its energy is used up. And what that means is eventually all the stars are going to burn out, and all of the matter is going to collapse into dead stars and black holes. And at that point, there will be no light, there will be no heat, there will be no life, only the corpses of dead stars and galaxies, ever expanding into the endless darkness and the cold recesses of space. What will be left is a universe in ruins. A reversal, you might say, of the creation account in Genesis 1 and 2. It's a kind of decreation, a death of our cosmos. This is our fate if death is allowed to reign. Which means that not only will the life of each individual person be erased from history as a result of this kind of entropy, but the entire universe, which makes all of our toiling under the sun utterly meaningless. It's like shuffling deck chairs on the Titanic. It may serve as a kind of distraction for the time being, but eventually the ship is going down and everything is going to be lost. So to talk about the cycle of life, right, if all life is going to come to an end and cease to exist, is utterly meaningless talk. This is what makes death our greatest enemy. Because if we end in nothing, then we are nothing. And to simply embrace that reality, right, to say, oh, I'm just going to embrace that, is not going to lead to delight. It can only lead to one place, unless you're being deluded, which is total despair. Jeff Bezos, part of the commercial, competition to get into space, right? He builds a rocket, and he comes up with this great idea. He's going to have actor William Shatner ride in the rocket, right? So he's going to have Captain Kirk, who's the star of all these Star Wars movies, who are going to... I thought, come on, I've got so many engineers in here. I'm surprised no guttural sound when I said Star Wars and Star Trek. Star Trek, okay? I know. Captain Kirk, not Star Wars. All the women are like, what? Star Trek. But what an idea he has, right? I want to have William Shatner go up. It'll be, Captain Kirk in this rocket into space, and he's a fairly eloquent man, so he'll come down and wax poetic about the majesty of the cosmos and all this. So they send him up. He comes back down. The cameras are rolling. Have you seen the clip? You got to Google it. He comes out and he's just in absolute despair. All he can say is, it's nothing but darkness. It's infinite darkness. It's death all the way down. There's no one there. We are all alone in the universe. Life is utterly meaningless. And you see Jeff Bezos just trying to shut him up, right? The exact opposite of what he wanted him to say. If death is a complete end, then despair, absolute, utter despair, is all that you have left. But if death is not a complete end, but only a transition, then we can look upon it not simply as an enemy, but also in a way as a friend. For it marks our transition into the heavenly realm and the comfort of resting in the bosom of our King. Death, in this sense, is gain, as Paul says, because it ushers us into the presence of the Lord. But here's the thing, that's not the end of the story. Our soul doesn't leave our body and then we exist in this bodiless, ether for all eternity. The Christian religion is about resurrection. It's about new creation. And that's what 1 Corinthians 15 makes plain. Because while Jesus died on Friday, descended into Hades, he rose from the dead on Sunday. And it was a bodily resurrection. Which means then that death's tyranny has been toppled. And that the heavens and earth will one day be fully restored, as we ourselves will be given new life. And we can then return in fullness to this royal vocation that we have, that we read about in the opening chapters of Genesis, to serve as kings of the earth. So on the one side then we have the modern medicalized narrative of death being an enemy that must be fought whatever the cost. And on the other side in the modern world we have this Stoic-inspired view that death is natural and we should just embrace it. So which is it? Is death an enemy or is it a friend? Well, in the Christian view, it's both. Death is not natural, as we said. It's totally unnatural. We were designed to live for eternity. And therefore, death is an enemy that is to be resisted. But we will only gain victory over that enemy. Its sting will only be removed at the resurrection. That's when our final enemy, death, will be put down, when it will be placed under the feet of our Lord. What this means then is when our time comes, we don't have to cling desperately to this life and try every experimental procedure and just stick whatever tube you have in me and fight all the way to the end. We don't have to do that. God has set us free to embrace the reality of our death. But we don't embrace it in despair. We don't embrace it in some sort of steely resolve, but in joy, in confident expectation of a brighter future. We embrace it for the joy that is set before us. Because of the truth of the resurrection, we are able to face death with dignity. The question now, then, is, given this fuller understanding of the meaning of death, what should our practices concerning it look like? How do we go about dying well? Well, this is a question we'll have to return to, because there's a lot to say. We have a lot to learn from church history on it. But let me leave you with 2 quick points of application. First, we have to, as best we can, allow the person who's dying to die with dignity. When it's time for them to go, we shepherd them to the point where they can joyfully embrace it, prepare themselves to meet the Lord. That's point number 1. The goal is to die with dignity, not grasping, right, but surrendering. But second, the home is the proper place to die. And this is not always possible. Sometimes people die in the middle of the street in a car accident, or they die in a foreign land. There was a time, one trip I had when I went to Zimbabwe, I used to go there all the time, and I got very ill. I don't know if I had dysentery or what it was, but there was a moment in there around the third day of not really being able to take in any fluids. I thought, this might be it, and I'm going to die in this land that's utterly foreign to me. Die alone, I felt. And everything in me longed, even if I'm going to die, just let me go home. Let me be home. Home is the proper place to die, which tells us that we need to build a home, right? And it's not just the location, but it is the location, but not just the location, but also everyone who is there. All of the people in your life, all the relationships that you have cultivated come to a head at the time of your death as that community comes around you to help usher you into the Lord's presence. Who's the community that you have around you now? If it were time for you to die, who would it be that would come around you and usher you into that? Let me end with this. As I said, my sister-in-law Laura, I just thank the Lord that she was allowed, that we chose for her to come home to die. She came home in the morning, and that evening she was very involved in special orchestra, so we had the orchestra conductor come over, and we sang and we played music, and we all sat together, the whole family and friends, in this small little room around her bed. And I will tell you, in that moment, time stood still. I almost felt like I'd lived an entire lifetime in that one evening. It's one of the most blessed, precious memories that I have. And while the pain of loss is real, right? Death is an enemy. That pain can be mitigated when the person dies well.